David Smith and his mother Angela arrived at the bustling Festival of Words on a bright Saturday morning. The air was filled with the rhythmic beats of music and the melodious flow of poetry recitations. David, a talented young poet, felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as he clutched his notebook, eager to compete in the festival's poetry slam. Angela watched her son with pride, remembering her own father's encouragement to embrace their roots. "You've got this, David," she said, squeezing his shoulder. "Your grandfather would be so proud." As they made their way through the crowd, the vibrant atmosphere of the festival enveloped them. Colorful banners hung between trees, and the scent of street food wafted through the air. David's eyes darted from one attraction to another, taking in the sights and sounds of the celebration of language and culture. They approached a hot dog stand adorned with word puzzles and riddles. The vendor, a jovial man with a thick mustache, called out to them, "Hey there, fancy a challenge? Solve the puzzle, win a hot dog." David's eyes lit up. He loved word games, and the prospect of a free lunch was enticing. "Can I try, Mom?" he asked, already stepping towards the stand. Angela nodded, amused by her son's enthusiasm. "Go for it, honey." The vendor presented a complex anagram, and David's brow furrowed in concentration. His lips moved silently as he rearranged the letters in his mind. After a minute, his face broke into a wide grin. "Got it!" he exclaimed, rattling off the solution. The vendor clapped his hands in delight. "Well done, young man. You've earned yourself and your mom a free lunch." As they received their hot dogs, David and Angela shared a laugh, reveling in the small victory. The taste of success was as sweet as the mustard on their lips. For David, it was more than just a free meal. It was a moment of connection to his heritage, a reminder of the power of words and wit that ran in his family. Unbeknownst to the Smiths, a group of police officers stood at a distance, observing the festival goers. Among them was Officer Cletus, a man known for his harsh demeanor and questionable views. His eyes narrowed as he watched the Smith family. "Look at them," Cletus muttered to his colleagues, his voice laced with disdain. "Probably up to no good." His fellow officers shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Cletus continued his surveillance, unaware of the challenge David had just won, his prejudice coloring his perception of an innocent family moment. As David and Angela moved away from the hot dog stand, savoring their well-earned meal and the joy of the festival, they were blissfully unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. The day that had started with such promise was about to take a dark turn, one that would test their resilience and change their lives forever. David and Angela, still buzzing from their small victory at the hot dog stand, made their way through the festival grounds. They were discussing which poetry stage David should visit first when Officer Cletus and two of his colleagues suddenly blocked their path. "Hold it right there," Cletus barked, his hand resting on his holster. "We saw you two at that hot dog stand. Care to explain where you got those?" Angela, taken aback by the hostile tone, instinctively stepped in front of David. "Excuse me, officer? We won those hot dogs fair and square. There was a word puzzle challenge, Dash." "Save it," Cletus interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. "We've had reports of theft in the area. You fit the description." David felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at his mother, then back at the officers, confusion and fear battling for dominance in his mind. "But sir, we didn't steal anything. We solved a puzzle and Dash. Did I ask you to speak, boy?" Cletus snapped, causing David to flinch. Angela's face hardened. "Officer, this is a misunderstanding. We can go back to the stand, and the vendor will confirm our story." Cletus sneered. "Oh, I'm sure you've got a whole network of people ready to back up your lies. You people always stick together, don't you?" The racist undertone of his words hung in the air like a noxious cloud. Angela's eyes widened in disbelief, while David felt a surge of shame and anger. He wanted to shout, to defend his mother, but fear kept him rooted to the spot. By now, a small crowd had gathered around them. Some people watched with concern, others with morbid curiosity, but no one stepped forward to intervene. "Mom," David whispered, his voice trembling. "What's happening?" Angela squeezed his hand, trying to project calm she didn't feel. "It's okay, honey. We've done nothing wrong." This will get sorted out. But Cletus wasn't interested in sorting anything out. He gestured to his colleagues. Pat them down. We'll see what else they've been helping themselves to. As the officers moved forward, David felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. He saw the mixture of pity and judgment in the eyes of the onlookers. In that moment, his excitement for the festival, his pride in his heritage, seemed to crumble away. For the first time in his young life, David felt the full weight of his skin color. He wondered if this was what it meant to be black in America, to be guilty until proven innocent, to have your word worth less than someone else's suspicion. Angela stood tall, her dignity intact despite the indignity of the situation. "We will cooperate, officers," she said, her voice steady. "But I want to make it clear that this is unjust and unnecessary." As the officers began their search, David closed his eyes, wishing he could disappear. The festival sounds faded into the background, replaced by the pounding of his heart and the whispers of the crowd. What had started as a day of celebration had turned into a nightmare, and David knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on David and Angela as they sat in the small, sterile interrogation room. The events at the festival felt like a distant nightmare, but the cold metal of the chairs beneath them was a stark reminder of their reality. David's shoulders slumped as he stared at the floor, unable to meet his mother's eyes. The shame and anger that had welled up inside him at the festival had morphed into a deep, gnawing sense of powerlessness. He replayed the incident in his mind, questioning every action, every word. Could he have done something differently? Should he have spoken up more forcefully? "David," Angela's soft voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "Look at me, son." Reluctantly, he raised his eyes to meet hers. The strength he saw there both comforted and confused him. "I know what you're thinking," she said, reaching out to take his hand. "You're wondering if this is what it means to be black, if this is our lot in life." David nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Mom, why did they treat us like that? We didn't do anything wrong. Is being black really such a bad thing?" Angela's eyes flashed with a mixture of pain and determination. "No, David, being black is not a bad thing. It's a beautiful, powerful thing. What happened to us today, that's not about who we are. It's about their ignorance and prejudice." She leaned in closer, her voice taking on a tone of quiet intensity. "Let me tell you about your great-grandmother. She marched with Dr. King. She faced water hoses and police dogs, but she never let it break her spirit. She knew that her blackness was not a burden, but a legacy of strength and resilience." David listened, feeling a spark of something ignite within him. His mother's words painted a picture of a heritage he had never fully appreciated before. "And your grandfather?" Angela continued, a small smile playing on her lips. "He used to say that our skin is like armor, forged by the struggles of our ancestors. It doesn't make us targets, it makes us warriors." As she spoke, David felt his posture straighten slightly. The weight of the day's events still pressed down on him, but something else was rising to meet it, a sense of pride and purpose he had never known before. "But Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "how do we fight against this? It feels so big, so overwhelming." Angela squeezed his hand. "We fight by not letting them define us. We fight by excelling, by speaking out, by standing tall. Remember what your grandfather always said? Your identity is your power, and no one can take that from you unless you let them." David nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of his eyes. For the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of hope. The injustice they had faced was real and painful, but so was the strength of his heritage. As they sat there, waiting for whatever came next, David made a silent promise to himself. He would not let this experience defeat him. Instead, he would use it as fuel, as a reason to stand up, to speak out, to make a difference. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights seemed less oppressive now. In its steady hum, David heard the echoes of his ancestors' voices, urging him to be strong, to be proud, to be himself. The day had changed him, yes, but not in the way Officer Cletus might have intended. Instead of breaking him down, it had planted the seeds of a new purpose, a new understanding of who he was and what he could become. As mother and son sat in silent solidarity, the first tendrils of that purpose began to take root, promising growth even in the harsh environment of injustice. The door to the interrogation room swung open with a metallic creak, breaking the contemplative silence between David and Angela. A man in a bright festival t-shirt entered, followed by Officer Cletus, whose face was twisted in a scowl. "Mr. and Mrs. Smith," the man said, his voice tinged with urgency and apology. "I'm Terry, one of the festival organizers. I'm here to clear up this misunderstanding." David straightened in his chair, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. Angela squeezed his hand, her eyes never leaving Terry's face. Terry turned to Cletus, his demeanor firm despite the officer's intimidating presence. "Officer, I have multiple witnesses, including the hot dog vendor, who can confirm that this young man won those hot dogs fair and square in a word challenge. There was no theft." Cletus's jaw clenched visibly. "That doesn't explain Dash." "It explains everything," Terry interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "These people are innocent festival-goers who were wrongly accused. I demand that you release them immediately." A tense silence filled the room. David held his breath, watching the internal struggle play out on Cletus's face. Finally, the officer let out a grunt of frustration. "Fine," he spat. "You're free to go, but I've got my eye on you." As they stood to leave, David caught Cletus's gaze. The look of pure contempt in the officer's eyes sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't over, David realized. This was just the beginning. Outside the police station, the late afternoon sun felt surreal after the harsh fluorescent lighting inside. Angela pulled David into a tight embrace, her body shaking slightly. "It's okay, Mom," David murmured, surprised to find himself comforting her. "We're out now." Angela pulled back, cupping David's face in her hands. "Listen to me, David. What happened today was wrong. It was unjust. But we can't let it define us. We won't let it break us." David nodded, feeling a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Relief, anger, determination. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We stand tall," Angela replied, her voice steady. "We speak our truth, and we fight for change, so this doesn't happen to anyone else." As they walked away from the station, David felt a new sense of purpose solidifying within him. The day's events had shaken him to his core, but they had also awakened something, a determination to confront injustice, to stand up for what was right. "Mom," he said as they reached their car, "I want to do something. I don't know what yet, but I can't just go back to normal after this." Angela smiled, a fierce pride shining in her eyes. "That's my boy. We'll figure it out together. This experience doesn't define us, but how we respond to it will." As they drove home, the festival fading in the rearview mirror, David's mind raced with ideas. He thought about poetry, about words, about the power of voice. He thought about his ancestors who had fought for justice, and he knew that their fight was now his fight too. The incident at the festival had been a harsh awakening, but it had also been a call to action. David Smith, the boy who had arrived at the festival eager to share his poetry, was leaving as a young man determined to use his voice for change. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and setbacks. But as David looked at his mother, saw the strength and resilience in her eyes, he knew they were ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would turn this moment of injustice into a catalyst for change, their voices joining the chorus of those fighting for equality and justice in a world that desperately needed it. The Smith family's living room buzzed with energy as David, Angela, and a group of young community members gathered around a coffee table strewn with papers and laptops. It had been 2 weeks since the incident at the festival, and the initial shock had transformed into a driving force for action. David stood at the center, his voice steady as he addressed the group. "We can't let what happened to us happen to anyone else. It's time we took a stand against racial profiling and police misconduct in our community." Nods of agreement rippled through the room. Angela watched from the kitchen doorway, pride swelling in her chest at her son's newfound purpose. "I've been doing some research," a young woman named Jade spoke up, her braids swaying as she leaned forward. "We could start by organizing awareness workshops at the community center. Education is key." David's face lit up. "That's a great idea, Jade. We could invite speakers who've dealt with similar situations, maybe even some legal experts to talk about our rights. And what about a social media campaign? Chimed in Marcus, his fingers flying over his laptop keyboard. We could share personal stories, statistics, and resources. Make it impossible for people to ignore what's happening. The room buzzed with excitement as ideas flowed freely. David felt a surge of energy coursing through him. This was more than just a response to what had happened to him and his mother. It was the beginning of a movement. We need to be strategic, Angela interjected, joining the group. Remember, we're up against deeply ingrained systems and attitudes. This won't be easy, but it's necessary. David nodded, grateful for his mother's grounding presence. Mom's right. We need to prepare for pushback. But that doesn't mean we back down. It means we need to be smarter, more organized. As the meeting progressed, plans began to take shape. They would start with a series of workshops at the community center, focusing on rights education and de-escalation techniques. Simultaneously, they would launch a social media campaign to raise awareness and gather support. I've been thinking, David said as the meeting was winding down. We need a name for our group. Something that captures what we're fighting for. After a moment of thoughtful silence, Angela spoke up. How about Voices for Change? Because that's what we are, voices speaking up against injustice, calling for real change. The suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement. As the group dispersed, each member charged with tasks for the coming weeks, David felt a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. The pain of the festival incident still lingered, but it was now fuel for a fire that burned bright with determination. Later that night, as David sat at his desk, he began to write. The words flowed from him, not in the form of poetry as he was used to, but as a powerful speech. He was preparing for their first community workshop, and he wanted his words to ignite the same passion in others that he felt burning inside him. As he wrote, David realized that this was more than just a response to one incident. It was about addressing a systemic issue, about standing up not just for himself and his mother, but for every person who had ever felt the sting of prejudice and injustice. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and setbacks. But as David looked at the faces of his new allies, at the determination in his mother's eyes, he knew they were ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would turn their pain into purpose, their voices joining the chorus of those fighting for equality and justice in a world that desperately needed it. As he finished his draft and climbed into bed, David felt a mix of excitement and nervousness for what lay ahead. But more than anything, he felt ready. Ready to speak, ready to act, ready to be the change he wanted to see in the world. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and David Smith had just taken his. The community center buzzed with anticipation as people filed into the main hall. Posters adorned the walls, bearing slogans like, "Know your rights" and "Equality now." At the front of the room, David stood behind a podium, his heart racing as he watched the seats fill up. It had been a month of intense preparation. The Voices for Change team had worked tirelessly, distributing flyers, creating social media content, and coordinating with local organizations. Now, as David looked out at the diverse crowd, he felt a mix of nervousness and determination. Angela gave him a reassuring nod from the front row. Taking a deep breath, David began his speech. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is David Smith, and a month ago, I was just a kid excited about a poetry festival. Today, I stand before you as someone who has experienced firsthand the pain of racial profiling and injustice. As David recounted the incident at the festival, a hush fell over the room. He spoke of the humiliation, the fear, and the anger he had felt. But more importantly, he spoke of the awakening that followed. What happened to my mother and me isn't unique. It's a reality that many in our community face every day. But tonight, we're here to say that it stops now. We're here to educate ourselves, to stand up for our rights, and to demand change. The audience listened intently as David outlined the goals of their campaign: education, awareness, and action. He introduced the legal experts and community leaders who would be speaking, emphasizing the importance of knowing one's rights and how to safely assert them. As the event progressed, the energy in the room grew. People shared their own stories, asked questions, and signed up for future workshops. David felt a surge of hope as he watched connections being made, alliances forming. However, amidst the positive energy, David couldn't help but notice a few skeptical faces. One attendee, an older man, stood up during the Q&A session. "This all sounds nice," he said, his voice tinged with cynicism. "But what makes you think a bunch of kids can change anything? The system's been this way for years." David felt a moment of doubt, but then he remembered his mother's words about the strength of their ancestors. He stepped up to the microphone. "Sir, I understand your skepticism, but history has shown us that change often starts with the young. We may be kids, but we're kids who are informed, passionate, and unafraid to speak up. And we're not alone. We have the support of our elders, our community leaders, and hopefully, people like you." The man nodded, seeming to consider David's words. As the session wrapped up, David felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. They had taken their first major step, but he knew it was just the beginning. As people filed out, many stopped to shake David's hand or share a word of encouragement. But amidst the positive feedback, David couldn't shake a nagging sense of frustration. He had hoped to see some local officials or police representatives at the event, but none had shown up. Angela, sensing her son's disappointment, put an arm around his shoulders. "Rome wasn't built in a day, honey. This is just the start." David nodded, forcing a smile. He knew his mother was right, but he couldn't help feeling impatient. The injustice they had faced still burned in his memory, fueling his desire for immediate change. As they packed up the materials from the event, David's mind was already racing with ideas for their next steps. The campaign had begun, and while the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: David Smith and the Voices for Change were just getting started. The seeds of change had been planted, and with nurturing and persistence, they would grow into a force that couldn't be ignored. The community center was abuzz with activity as David and his team set up for their fundraising event. Colorful banners hung from the walls, proclaiming equality for all and justice now. Tables lined the room, laden with baked goods, handmade crafts, and informational pamphlets about their cause. As David helped arrange chairs, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. In the 2 months since their first workshop, Voices for Change had gained significant momentum. Their social media following had exploded, and they'd even caught the attention of local news outlets. Angela approached, her arms full of donation boxes. "Everything looks great, honey. Are you ready for your speech?" David nodded, patting the folded paper in his pocket. "As ready as I'll ever be. I just hope we can raise enough to fund those Know Your Rights workshops we've been planning." The event was in full swing when a commotion at the entrance caught David's attention. His heart sank as he recognized the figure pushing through the crowd: Officer Cletus. Cletus swaggered into the room, his eyes scanning the faces until they locked onto David. A sneer twisted his lips as he approached. "Well, well," Cletus drawled, loud enough for nearby attendees to hear. "If it isn't our little rebel, still playing at being a hero?" David felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Officer Cletus, I don't recall inviting law enforcement to this event." Cletus chuckled, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Didn't need an invitation, boy. Just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Seems to me like you're just stirring up trouble, looking for attention." The room had gone quiet, all eyes on the confrontation. David could feel the tension building, could see the fear and anger on the faces of his supporters. He knew he had to handle this carefully. Taking a deep breath, David straightened his shoulders and looked Cletus in the eye. "This isn't about attention, officer. It's about justice. It's about ensuring that what happened to me and my mother doesn't happen to anyone else." Cletus scoffed. "What happened to you? You mean when you were caught stealing and faced the consequences?" A murmur of discontent rippled through the crowd. David felt a hand on his shoulder, his mother, offering silent support. "We both know that's not what happened," David said, his voice steady. "We were wrongly accused, humiliated, and detained without cause. And we're not alone. Many in this community have faced similar injustices." David gestured to the room, to the faces watching intently. "These people are here because they want change. They want a community where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of the color of their skin." Cletus's face darkened. "You're playing a dangerous game, boy. You might think you're making a difference, but you're just making trouble for yourself." The threat in his words was clear, but David refused to back down. "If standing up for what's right is making trouble, then that's what we'll do. We won't be silenced by intimidation or threats." As if on cue, supporters began to gather around David, forming a protective circle. Cletus looked around, seemingly realizing for the first time that he was outnumbered. "This isn't over," Cletus growled, backing towards the exit. "You do well to watch your step." As Cletus stormed out, the room erupted in applause. People patted David on the back, offering words of encouragement and support. But even as he smiled and thanked them, David couldn't shake the chill that had settled in his stomach. Later, as they cleaned up after the event, Angela pulled David aside. "I'm proud of you for standing your ground," she said, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and concern. "But be careful, David. Cletus isn't one to make idle threats." David nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The confrontation had made one thing clear. Their campaign was making waves, and not everyone was happy about it. As he looked around at his team, still buzzing with excitement from the successful event, David realized that their fight was far from over. The path ahead would be challenging, possibly even dangerous. But as David thought about the faces in the crowd, the stories he'd heard, the injustices that still needed to be addressed, he knew they couldn't back down now. They had come too far, touched too many lives. With renewed determination, David began to plan their next move. The confrontation with Cletus had raised the stakes, but it had also strengthened his resolve. Change was coming, and voices for change would be at the forefront, no matter the obstacles ahead. In the weeks following the confrontation with Officer Cletus, the atmosphere in the community shifted palpably. David and the Voices for Change found themselves at the center of a growing movement, but also facing increasing tension and scrutiny. The group organized a series of peaceful protests, each drawing larger crowds than the last. David, with his eloquent speeches and unwavering determination, became the face of the movement. Local news outlets began covering their activities, bringing wider attention to their cause. One crisp morning, as David prepared for a protest march, his phone buzzed with a notification. His heart raced as he read the email, an invitation to speak at a regional conference on racial equality and police reform. "Mom," he called out, his voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. "You won't believe this." Angela rushed in, concern etched on her face, only to break into a wide smile as David shared the news. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful. Your voice is being heard." As they embraced, celebrating this milestone, a knock at the door interrupted their moment. Angela opened it to find two uniformed police officers, their expressions grim. "David Smith," one officer asked, "we need to ask you a few questions about the disturbances you've been causing in the community." David felt a chill run down his spine, but he stepped forward, his voice steady. "I'm David Smith, and we haven't been causing disturbances. We've been exercising our right to peaceful protest." The officers exchanged glances. "We've received complaints about noise violations and obstruction of public spaces. We're here to issue a warning." As the officers spoke, David couldn't help but wonder if Cletus was behind this. The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. After the officers left, Angela turned to David, her face a mask of worry. "David, I think it's time we consider legal representation. This is getting serious." David nodded, the weight of their struggle settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew the risks were escalating, but he also knew they couldn't back down now. The day of the conference arrived, and David found himself standing before a diverse audience of activists, community leaders, and even a few sympathetic law enforcement officials. As he looked out at the sea of faces, he felt a surge of determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and strong, "I stand before you not just as David Smith, but as a voice for countless individuals who have faced injustice and discrimination." He shared his story, not just of the incident at the festival, but of the movement it had sparked. He spoke of the challenges they'd faced, the threats and intimidation, but also of the hope and solidarity they'd found in their community. "We're not fighting against the police," he emphasized. "We're fighting against a system that allows prejudice and abuse of power to go unchecked. We're fighting for a future where everyone, regardless of their skin color, can feel safe and respected in their own community. As he concluded his speech, the room erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, moved by his words and the passion behind them. In that moment, David felt a mix of emotions: pride in how far they'd come, hope for the change they were creating, but also a lingering fear of the challenges that still lay ahead. Later that evening, as David scrolled through the overwhelmingly positive social media responses to his speech, a message from an unknown number popped up on his screen. His blood ran cold as he read it. "You're playing with fire, boy. Better watch your back." David's hand trembled as he showed the message to his mother. Angela's face hardened with resolve. "We need to document this," she said firmly, "and we need to be more careful, but we won't let them intimidate us into silence." As they discussed their next steps, David realized that their fight for justice had entered a new, more dangerous phase. The stakes were higher, the risks more real. But as he thought about the faces he'd seen at the conference, the stories he'd heard, he knew they couldn't give up now. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, but David Smith and the Voices for Change were committed to seeing it through, no matter the cost. The movement they'd started had grown beyond them, and now it was their responsibility to nurture it, to guide it, and to ensure that their voices continued to be heard. A week after the conference, David was helping his mother prepare dinner when his phone erupted with notifications. Puzzled, he picked it up and felt his heart skip a beat. A video was circulating on social media, and it was spreading like wildfire. "Mom," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "You need to see this." Angela hurried over, wiping her hands on her apron. Together, they watched the shaky footage captured by a bystander at the festival months ago. The video clearly showed David winning the hot dog challenge, followed by the confrontation with Officer Cletus and his colleagues. The unjust treatment they had endured was now on display for the world to see. "Oh my God," Angela whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "How did this surface now?" David shook his head, still in shock. "I don't know, but it's everywhere. Look at the view count." As they scrolled through the comments, they saw an outpouring of support mixed with expressions of outrage at the officer's behavior. The video had ignited a firestorm of public indignation. Within hours, local news stations picked up the story. David's phone rang incessantly with calls from reporters seeking comments. The Voices for Change social media accounts were flooded with messages of solidarity and offers of support. "David," Angela said, her voice filled with a mix of pride and concern, "I think we need to make a statement. This is our chance to really push for change." David nodded, feeling a surge of determination. He quickly drafted a statement with his mother's help, calling for a formal investigation into the incident and broader reforms in police training and accountability. As they released the statement, the story continued to gain traction. National news outlets picked it up, and soon, David found himself being interviewed on major networks. "What do you hope will come from this video being released?" one reporter asked. David took a deep breath before answering. "We hope this will be a wake-up call. What happened to us isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem that needs to be addressed. We're calling for transparency, accountability, and real change in how our communities are policed." The public reaction was overwhelming. Protests erupted across the city, with people demanding justice for the Smiths and others who had faced similar treatment. The police department found itself under intense scrutiny. A few days later, David received word that Officer Cletus had been called in for an internal investigation. The news filled him with a mix of relief and apprehension. While he was glad that action was being taken, he couldn't help but worry about potential backlash. As he sat in their living room, watching coverage of the protests on TV, David felt a whirlwind of emotions. The movement they had started had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. Their personal story had become a catalyst for a larger conversation about racial profiling and police accountability. "You okay, honey?" Angela asked, sitting down beside him. David nodded slowly. "Yeah, just processing it all. Do you think this will really change anything?" Angela wrapped an arm around her son's shoulders. "Change doesn't happen overnight, David. But this is a big step. We've opened people's eyes. Now we need to make sure they stay open." As they sat together, watching the crowds on the screen chanting for justice, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. The truth was out there now, undeniable and raw. The road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time, he felt like real change was within reach. The revelation of the video had shifted the dynamics of their struggle. What had once been a local movement was now part of a national conversation. David knew that the coming days would be crucial. They needed to harness this momentum, to push for concrete reforms while the spotlight was on them. As he began to jot down ideas for their next steps, David realized that their fight was far from over. In fact, it was just entering a new, more critical phase. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time to ensure that it led to lasting change. The weeks following the video's release were a whirlwind of activity. David and the Voices for Change found themselves at the center of a national debate on police reform and racial justice. As the internal investigation into Officer Cletus progressed, more stories of misconduct began to surface. One morning, David woke up to breaking news. Officer Cletus had been suspended pending a full investigation. Reports indicated that a pattern of racist behavior and abuse of power had been uncovered, extending far beyond the incident with the Smiths. David sat on the edge of his bed, a mix of emotions washing over him. There was relief, certainly, but also a sobering realization of the work that still lay ahead. As he made his way downstairs, he found Angela in the kitchen, her eyes glued to her tablet. "David," she called out, her voice tight with excitement. "You need to see this." He leaned over her shoulder to read the email on the screen. It was from the mayor's office, inviting David to participate in a newly formed task force on community policing and racial equity. "They want your input on policy reforms," Angela said, her eyes shining with pride. "Your voice is being heard at the highest levels now." David felt a surge of determination. This was an opportunity to effect real change, to translate their movement's energy into concrete action. The next few months were a blur of meetings, public forums, and intense discussions. David found himself working alongside community leaders, legal experts, and progressive police officials who were committed to reform. As summer turned to fall, the first set of policy changes were announced. New training programs on racial bias and de-escalation techniques were implemented for all officers. An independent review board was established to investigate complaints of police misconduct. The city also committed to investing in community programs aimed at building trust between law enforcement and minority communities. On a crisp autumn evening, David stood before a crowd gathered in the same park where the festival had taken place months ago. But this time, he wasn't there to compete in a poetry slam. He was there to address the community as a recognized leader and advocate. "When I stood in this park months ago, I was a teenager excited about a poetry competition," he began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. "I never imagined that a simple misunderstanding would lead us here. But today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as a voice for change." He outlined the progress they had made and the challenges that still lay ahead. As he spoke, he saw faces in the crowd nodding in agreement, eyes shining with hope and determination. "This is not the end of our journey," David continued. "It's a new beginning. We've shown what's possible when we stand together, when we refuse to be silenced. Now, we must continue to hold our leaders accountable and work tirelessly to build the just and equitable community we all deserve." As David concluded his speech, the park erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, their voices joining in a chant for justice and equality. Later that evening, as David and Angela walked home, a familiar figure approached them. It was Terry, the festival organizer who had helped clear their names all those months ago. "David, Angela," he greeted them warmly. "I have some news I thought you'd like to hear in person. The committee has decided to dedicate next year's Festival of Words to the theme of social justice. And we'd be honored if you'd be our keynote speaker, David." David felt a lump form in his throat. It felt like his journey had come full circle. "I'd be honored," he managed to say. As Terry walked away, Angela pulled David into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "Your grandfather would be too." David nodded, feeling the weight of his ancestors' struggles and triumphs. He had found his voice, and in doing so, had helped amplify the voices of many others. As they continued their walk home, David reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The pain and injustice they had faced had been transformed into a powerful force for change. There was still work to be done, challenges to overcome, but he felt ready to face them. The festival of words that had once been a source of excitement for his poetry had become a symbol of something much larger. It now represented the power of words to inspire, to unite, and to change the world. David Smith, once a young poet unsure of his place in the world, had become a leader, an advocate, and a beacon of hope for his community. As he looked towards the future, he knew that the story of Voices for Change was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning a new chapter, one filled with promise, purpose, and the unwavering belief in the power of speaking truth to power.